Welcome to the second educational module from the Arizona Convention of States, Advanced Information. If you haven't yet completed the first module, Getting Started, it is suggested that you do so first in order to provide you with a strong foundation on which to build. You may want to pause this presentation and gather something to write with, as you will be provided with resource information throughout this module. Let's take a look at our learning objectives for this session. In this module, you will learn to articulate the differences between a constitutional convention and an Article 5 Convention of States, of the various groups, arguments, and tactics who are actively working against an Article 5 Convention of States, accurate, positive responses to common arguments used against the concept of an Article 5 Convention of States, and to use an advanced, frequently asked question sheet to refute common arguments against the Article 5 Convention of States concepts. So what's the problem? Once someone is exposed to the concept of a Convention of States for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution under Article 5, for example, after viewing the previous training module, many people wonder why all Americans aren't ready to push for this concept immediately. One of the largest roadblocks against support for an Article 5 amending convention is the confusion that arises between what people believe about a constitutional convention versus an Article 5 amending convention. Let's take a look at the definition of these two very different events, beginning with a constitutional convention. A constitutional convention, sometimes referred to as a con-con, is a gathering for the purpose of writing a new constitution or revising an existing constitution. A general constitutional convention is called to create the first constitution of a political unit or to entirely replace an existing constitution. Our current Constitution is the result of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. An Article 5 amending convention of states, however, is a convention called by state legislatures for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. They are given power to do this under Article 5 of the Constitution. It is not a constitutional convention. It cannot throw out the Constitution because its authority is derived from the existing Constitution itself. As a supporter of the Convention of States movement, your understanding of the difference between these two convention types is one of the most important things you must be able to articulate. The inability to describe the important differences will result in misunderstandings and the spreading of fear about what we are trying to accomplish. Once again, in brief and simple terms, a constitutional convention, sometimes referred to as a con-con, exists to establish or replace a constitution. The Convention of 1787, where our Constitution was established, was indeed a constitutional convention. An Article 5 amending convention of states exists to propose, debate, and vote on possible amendments to the existing Constitution. In fact, an Article 5 amending convention of states is, as James Madison once asserted, subject to the forms of the Constitution. In other words, it is not plenipotentiary or constitutional in nature, and only exists because of the Constitution in the first place. Why is there this confusion in the first place? The runaway convention scenario was conjured up in the 19th century to dissuade state lawmakers from bypassing Congress through the state application and convention process. The scenario became famous during the 1960s when liberal activists, legislators, and academics raised it to defeat an application campaign for amendments that would have overturned some Supreme Court decisions. Various groups have employed the same tactic to defeat balanced budget amendment proposals over the years. In one of the ironies of history, some deeply conservative groups now promote the runaway convention scenario as well. one can expect both liberal and conservative opponents to promote it again if another application campaign, like ours, begins to gain traction. In the runaway convention scenario, state legislatures attempt to limit the convention through their applications, but once the convention meets, the commissioners disregard the applications and their subsequent instructions. Instead, heedless of their reputations, their political futures, and all ties of honor, the commissioners issue proposed amendments that are beyond their legal authority. In the more extreme versions of the runaway scenario, the convention's proposed amendments reinstate slavery, abolish the Bill of Rights, or otherwise completely alter the American form of government. To prevent the states from blocking their proposals, the convention also changes the method of ratifying to a method it finds more to its liking. While the Congress, the President, the courts, and the military all inexplicably sit by and permit this to unfold, the convention imposes a new, more authoritarian government on America. In the more moderate versions of the runaway scenario, the convention is unable to change the ratification process, but 3/4 of the states nevertheless ratify amendments they did not authorize and do not want. Of course, even the more moderate version of the runaway convention scenario shows a slender regard for political reality. At the very least, commissioners who willfully disregard limits on their authority would suffer severe loss of reputation and probably compromise fatally their political futures. This may explain why, in the long history of the hundreds of American state and interstate conventions, only an odd handful of delegates have actually suggested going rogue. In sum, there are far more political and legal constraints on a runaway convention than on a runaway Congress. So who is spreading this false narrative? Although there are several groups that use these scenarios to argue against an Article 5 amended convention, the John Birch Society is one of the most vocal. The John Birch Society describes itself as a constitutionalist organization, yet it is highly critical of a very important component of the Constitution. The John Birch Society does not like Article 5's provision that allows the states to unilaterally propose and ratify amendments to the Constitution. Let's address some common misconceptions. First, if the federal government doesn't follow the Constitution now, why do we think they'll follow new amendments? This is a very common remark from those who question the validity of an attempt to organize an amending convention of states. In actuality, it's not that the federal government doesn't adhere to the Constitution, but most of the problems we now face are the result of constitutional interpretations that capitalize on ambiguities in the wording of certain phrases, like the General Welfare Clause, now interpreted as unlimited power to spend. So we can restore the federal government to its proper, limited place only by clarifying the original meaning of those phrases through constitutional amendments, effectively overturning the bad Supreme Court precedents that have eviscerated our federal system. Here's another common misconception. We should fear the use of the Article 5 convention mechanism because Congress, which is given the duty to call the convention upon application by 34 states, then proceeds to dictate the operations of the convention, determine the scope of the proposals to be discussed, and even select the delegates to attend it. The states control the Article 5 convention process from beginning to end. Congress's role is limited to issuing the call once it receives 34 applications for a convention on the same topic. The call simply sets the date, time, and location of the meeting. The state legislatures control the selection and commissioning of their convention delegates. Let's take a look at one more misconception. And this one goes back to our discussion about the difference between a constitutional convention and an Article 5 amending convention. The misconception goes like this. At an Article 5 convention, our entire Constitution will be thrown open for surgery, including our Bill of Rights. In actuality, the Convention of States Project application limits the scope of an Article 5 convention to proposing amendments that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and set term limits for officials and members of Congress. States can instruct their delegates to entertain only a more narrow scope of proposals, but they cannot broaden the topic beyond that identified in the 34 triggering applications. Contrary conclusions have no basis in fact, law, or history. So what safeguards are actually in place to ensure that an amending convention won't run away? There are numerous redundant safeguards on the Article 5 convention process. First, the scope of authority for the convention is defined by the topic specified in the 34 applications that trigger the convention. These applications are the very source of authority for the convention to begin with. Any proposals beyond that scope would be out of order, and any single delegate could object to their consideration. Second, even if not a single convention delegate objected to an out-of-order proposal, and/or even if the convention delegates had installed a parliamentarian who refused to sustain an objection, state legislatures can recall any delegates who exceed their authority or instructions. This is because convention delegates are legally acting as agents of their state legislature and are subject to the instructions given by their state legislature. As a matter of basic agency law, any actions taken outside the scope of a delegate's authority would be void. Next, even if a majority of convention delegates went rogue and state legislatures failed to stop commissioners, their legal agents, from acting beyond their powers, and Congress nevertheless sent the illicit amendment proposals to the states for ratification, the courts would declare the proposals void. While the courts don't have a wonderful track record in interpreting broad constitutional language, they do have an excellent track record of enforcing clear, technical matters of procedure and agency law. And last, even if all of those protections failed, it borders on insanity to think that 38 states, the requirement for ratification, would ratify an amendment proposed under these circumstances. It is clear that from legal, procedural, moral, and practical standpoints, a runaway convention would never happen. How to directly address the John Birch Society. Beyond the definitions and misconceptions we have already discussed in this presentation, one of the leaders of the Convention of States movement, Michael Ferris, has meticulously answered 16 very specific questions posed by the John Birch Society. Due to the scope and detail of the responses, we are providing a link on your screen to this document. Now that you already have a higher level of understanding on these issues, it is well worth your time to read this document as well. If your media player doesn't support your ability to click on this link, please pause this presentation now to copy the web address to this important document. By the way, as an interesting footnote, the John Birch Society supported and promoted its own small government initiative in the 1970s called the Liberty Amendment. This initiative called for an amending convention of states as outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution as the method for forwarding the Liberty Amendment. Why the John Birch Society supported and promoted this idea 40 years ago and fight and misrepresent the same process today is unclear. Other resources. There are many excellent documents located here at the link on your screen to assist you in understanding of how to defend the Convention of States concept from well-meaning but misguided attacks. Once you begin to discuss the Convention of States concepts, whether in person, email, social media, etc., you will be surprised at the level of disinformation you will encounter. It is up to you to be prepared to address it with accurate information. Congratulations on the completion of this module. You are now among the best educated people with regards to the constitutional amendment process as described in Article 5 of our Constitution. If you believe that this is our best hope to rein in an out-of-control federal government, spread the word and encourage friends and family to join the movement today.